Coming back for the Growing SA Conference, brought to you by Livestock SA and Grain Producers SA. We are moving now in our next session from the science and the technology focus to the national landscape, the opportunities and challenges that exist for South Australian agriculture. There's been a huge amount of change since the last Growing SA Conference, which we could only have in 2019. And we will hear now from two of the ag industry's leading organisations in advocacy and policy, which have been navigating the changes and challenges of recent years. We'll start with the National Farmers Federation shortly. Their 2030 roadmap outlined a bold vision for growth in farm gate value, the Australian agriculture target of $100 billion in industry value by 2030. We've talked about it every week on FlowFM. The target is well known and has been widely accepted and endorsed by government and stakeholders. But since then, we've had this COVID-19 situation, trade and market access challenges, droughts. I think that's more so in the Northern Hemisphere, but they're all market factors, but they're naturally going to come again here as well. There's all manner of challenges to derail us from that $100 billion target. The CEO of the National Farmers Federation, Tony Mahar, is going to update us on progress towards that $100 billion goal and what else industry needs to do to ensure it is reached. Tony comes from a farming background in southwest Victoria, working in agriculture for the majority of his working life, with experience working for global food manufacturers, major Australian agribusinesses and the Commonwealth Department of Ag. He was appointed Farmers Federation CEO in March 2016 after being the Trade and Economics Manager there and Deputy CEO. Please welcome Tony Mahar.
Thanks, Rikki. Good morning, everyone. I'll have to start tuning into Flow FM to hear you talk about the roadmap. I'm glad that you're talking about that regularly. So, yeah, look, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be, back over in South Australia and at this conference, Growing SA. So thank you to GPSA and Livestock SA and Primary Producers for inviting me over. I've got a few slides. I'll try and whip through them. I'm going to try and give you a bit of an update on the roadmap, the $100 billion target, which I hope some of you have heard about before, and go into a little bit of detail about that and why it's relevant to you. And then I'd like to just give a bit of an overview of the Albanese government, the 47th Parliament, what that looks like. We're based in Canberra. That's part of my day job, is to spend a lot of time up at Parliament House talking to politicians and key decision makers. So I'll give you a bit of an overview of that and then touch on what I think are a couple of really important issues that we're facing from an agriculture sector. So, and then be great to have any questions if there are any at the end. So, quickly on the NFF, I expect that some of you will know a little bit of background about the NFF or be aware of the NFF, but we're 42 years old now, and we were formed back in 1979 when 9 organisations then got together and decided that there would be some value in having a single national, coordinated, consistent voice to government, and they formed the National Farmers Federation in 1979. And the organisation's got a little bit of history around industrial relations and trade and economics and sustainability, but really it's a critical role in Canberra to, and I'll touch on this when I get to the Job Summit and things, to have a voice in Canberra to the Parliament. So not just the government, but the opposition, and increasingly, as we're all very familiar following last election, independents and minor parties. So that's my day job. I work in Canberra with a small team, and we work with organisations like GPSA and Livestock SA through Primary Producers South Australia and all of the other members across our membership, which looks like that. So we do have every state farming group in the country as a member of NFF, and that is absolutely vital. We have most commodity councils, peak bodies that you can see up there in the screen, so from cane to grain to rice to cotton to dairy to horticulture increasingly. There's about 37 peak horticulture groups, but we've got them in under one banner, the Horticulture Council of the NFF, which we've worked really hard to do to make sure that horticulture has a voice at that national level. And we place a high level of importance on this is what makes my job so interesting and so fun, but getting a coordinated, consistent message across all of those states and all of those commodities, because it is incredibly powerful to have a united, consistent, clear message to government. And I keep saying government, but it's also to other stakeholders across the country. So whether they're retailers, whether they're universities, whether they're banks, whether they're mining industries, whether they're other industries, the importance that we place on a solid policy foundation and a policy voice that we can give to those discussions and sit around the table like we are on Thursday at the Jobs Summit is incredibly powerful. So I just wanted to reiterate that through GPSA, through Livestock SA, through Primary Producers South Australia, the producers in South Australia have a strong voice at the national level. And that works best when there is contribution and input into that policy development process. And everyone from Joe and Travis to Adrian, to Cam and Caroline help us do that job in Canberra. And I just wanted to reiterate that that is a really critical role. We place huge amount of importance on getting that flow up of policy. So when Fiona Simpson, the President, or myself happen to stand up in front of a camera or in front of a decision maker, we know that the policy that NFF has, it's not my policy or it's not Fiona's policy, it's the members' policy. And there's a mechanism that develops that and makes that a robust policy. So, yeah, just really important. I just wanted to reiterate that it's an incredibly powerful voice and opportunity. So the roadmap, we developed the roadmap in 2018, and the reason, or there was a couple of reasons why we did it. We wanted to set an aspiration, a goal, a target that everyone in the industry could get behind. And we went around the country and did 26 road shows in bowling clubs and shearing sheds and things like that, and sat down with farmers and said, what do we think the future looks like? Where do we want to go? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And we developed this roadmap so that we as the national body could have a strong, clear message. But we also developed it so that farmers on the ground, industry associations in states or commodities could actually have something as well that they could subscribe to that would be part of that broader picture. That when we talk about infrastructure or environment or biodiversity, biosecurity, labour, all of these things that have just a slight nuance for individual commodities or individual regions, that there was this overarching plan for the agriculture industry in Australia to be more profitable, be more productive, be more sustainable, build trust with consumers, and that was that roadmap. So we've got 5 pillars in the roadmap, and I'll take you through those briefly. When we developed it, we hoped that it would get some traction. We hoped that it wouldn't sit on the shelf and someone would say, oh yeah, the NFF did a plan for a $100 billion industry, and it would fade, dissolve away. It's fair to say that we've been excited and surprised and delighted about how much it's set the narrative. It is now the thing that people talk about when they talk about the agriculture industry, is getting to the $100 billion target that was set by our roadmap. Governments of all colours have strapped onto it and adopted it and like to use it whenever they can. And that, again, is incredibly powerful, because what it does is actually allow you to have a conversation and say, do we all agree that we can get to that $100 billion target? And everyone says, yeah, great idea, great. You know, they quibble about whether it's a farm gate value or whether we should go for profitability or productivity. And I've had those conversations, and I'm happy to have them again, because that, again, is about the conversation. Why we didn't set a profitability target and things like that. But it really allows you a foot in the door and a conversation around, this is our aspiration for the industry. And that then leads you to talk about some of the challenges, but also the opportunities. So it's been incredibly rewarding to build this thing with farmer input and put it out there, and we're now in our 4th or 5th year. So there's 5 pillars, and I won't bore you to death and go through each of them, but we could have had 7 pillars, we could have had 3. 5 pillars, there's about 63 different actions in there. And we were really conscious when we developed this that we didn't want it to just sit on the shelf and then forget about it. So every year we report on how we're going against each of the targets and each of the metrics in there. But you can see the 5 pillars: customers, We want to make sure, so I'll just touch on a couple of things in each of the pillars. We want to make sure that agriculture is a trusted industry. We think, and there's some people in this room have done a lot of work on trust and community engagement, but we think that agriculture has a really good base from which to work. We're trusted, people like farmers, they like obviously the food and fibre that farmers produce, but our view was that we don't want to continue to draw down on that trust bucket. When something goes wrong, and it does and it will, and it has, that we need to be able to maintain that trust of being in the forefront in a positive way in consumers' mind. So that was one of the sorts of actions. And these actions that are in there, they do range from the high level around trade and energy efficiency and those sorts of things, but also down to some of the more basic or more tangible. And some of those are around things like making sure that every farm business has a business plan. Now, most businesses might have them, or they might have an old one. Those sorts of things are practical measures that, if Farmer Joe or Joanne picks up this roadmap, then they can look through it and say, okay, I can see where this impacts for me. Also, succession planning is another one of those things. We know how challenging and difficult that can be, that we've set ourselves a target to have a better adoption of succession planning in the industry. So it's really high level and hopefully some grassroots level in there as well. So there's a couple of things in there. Trust from a sustainability point of view, I'll touch on that, but rewarding and recognising farmers for what they do every day, and that's managing the landscape. Paying them for actually looking at sustainability and biodiversity and some of the things that Madeline talked about before, which I thought was really interesting. Innovation's obviously key. Renewable energy, people and communities, critical. Everyone knows the labour shortages that have been facing the industry for a decade or more and have been exacerbated in the last 2 years or 2 or 3 years with COVID. So a range of different activities in under there, and obviously one of them is managing risk. And we know that by and large, generally speaking, it's challenging to say that without getting yourselves into trouble, but myself into trouble. But the industry's had a couple of good years. Better in some parts than others, of course, but the next drought and the next hardship is going to be on its way, if I know anything about the agriculture sector. So preparing for and managing drought, but also obviously floods and fires that we've seen in the last couple of years that have impacted on some regions pretty heavily. So that's a really quick overview of the aspirations. And when we have these conversations with the community, with farmers or with politicians or anyone else, we've got a really good base on which to have the discussion about a roadmap for that future. So when we started the journey in 2018, the industry was valued at around about $58 or $60 billion, and that was coming off the back of arguably the worst drought that this country's ever had. So 4 years in, we are up over $80 billion. So we're tracking pretty well. We're going okay off the back of a few good seasons. So if that trajectory continues, and it's unlikely to, as I say, we've had a few good years, but if we get another 20 billion in the next 4 years, my job will be done by 2026. We can pack up and set ourselves a new target. But easy to say, much harder to do, obviously. We've had high commodity prices and a couple of good years, which have really driven that target. But the trajectory is going quite well. And again, if we had set ourselves in 2018 to pick that would be $20 billion better than from a farm gate value in 4 years, I think we'd take that every day of the week. So let's hope it continues. So how will it continue? Well, there's a few things that we think will help get us there. Obviously, the conditions forecast for another year or two of La Nina, which will be good for production, obviously. Commodity prices are expected to continue to trend upwards. Again, challenging and dangerous to say that, but they're looking like they're going okay. Land values continue to rise, and again, that's got a downside, obviously, if you're trying to get into the industry or trying to buy property, but land values are contributing to the $100 billion target. Digital connectivity, and that's, again, really challenging across the country, I know, but technology, ag tech, data is making gains in productivity and efficiency incredibly attractive and incredibly accessible. And environmental markets, we do think off the back of, again, what Madeline was talking about before around the market for environmental services, biodiversity, natural capital, whatever you want to call it, I think there's huge opportunities there if we utilise the data properly, that we can take a front foot in the sustainability debate, and I'll touch on that in a second. But there's some challenges, of course. Labour, critical issue across the sector, across the country. So no surprises there. Input prices and the supply, the security of supply, so whether that's fertiliser, fuel or chemical, we know there's some significant challenges in that space. Biosecurity, could talk all morning on that. That's a massive challenge that if we don't get right, then we'll get nowhere near the $100 billion target. The trade uncertainty, the global dynamics that we've seen in the last few years have been incredibly challenging. And then we've got environmental regulation. So yes, there's some nice tailwinds, but there's a few big, strong headwinds that we're going to have to walk through as well. That all makes it fun, makes it interesting, but there's some real challenges, but we're going in the right direction. So in terms of just an additional bit of commentary on what I sort of see as some of the uncertainty going forward, obviously the conflict in Ukraine has and disruptions associated with China are going to continue to have a major impact on the sector. We all know in this room probably that Ukraine's a massive producer of grain, a massive influencer on the global market, and that's going to continue to play out in a negative way, I suspect, for the next couple of years. And likewise, as I said, supply of fertiliser, fuel, chemicals is going to be a challenge. We've walked through it okay so far, but there'll be some continued challenges. Prices are looking pretty good across most commodities. Again, I hesitate to say that, but the prices are not going too bad. And obviously with interest rates scheduled to rise, that will have an impact on cash flow and things depending on each organisation's situation. But it does seem to be, if you look at the forecasts, that interest rates will go up for a little while and then perhaps stabilise. So that's hopefully what we'll see coming. So shifting away from the roadmap just briefly, to give you a bit of an insight into the Parliament. We've obviously got a new government after 10 years or so of a Liberal national coalition, and they were swept to power off the back of a few things, but climate change was clearly one of them. Jobs and manufacturing in this country was a key part of their mandate, and that National Reconstruction Fund, we hope part of that is directed towards agricultural manufacturing, again, whether that's fertiliser, fuel, food and fibre value adding, repairing international relationships, which is going to be a challenge, jobs and skills, and the cost of living. So that was the agenda for the Albanese government. And from our perspective, we're focusing on a few things. We've got the workers, which we're heading to the Jobs Summit on Thursday, which will put forward our key asks in that space. And we've got a real focus on regionalisation. We think that this government will focus a little bit more on rural and regional communities, which sounds strange given the National Party was part of the coalition, but it's not necessarily a new issue. It's just the opportunity is presenting itself off the back of COVID and working remotely in things that we think there is a real opportunity to invest better in regions. There's a couple of real challenges, the Murray-Darling Basin and 450 buybacks, live sheep exports, and the fuel tax credit scheme is always on the table and we can never relax about that, and also the biosecurity funding is a critical issue. I wanted to talk brief. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to be quick. Sustainability. It is increasingly coming to the front, if it wasn't already, a major issue facing the industry. And some of you would have seen the State of the Industry report that was released by Tanya Plibersek about a month ago now, and it was pretty damning on the state of the environment, so particularly on things like native animals and degradation of land. So that, with addition to some of it, again, we'll see the developments by Canadian, Netherlands government, Malaysian government around reductions in nitrates and emissions and things like that. Who would have thought that the Canadian government and the Netherlands government, two of the leading ag producers and exporters around the world, have put in place policies that are seeking to reduce nitrate use, animal emissions, chemical use, fertiliser use. So that's a bit of a warning sign for a country like Australia, a major exporting country, of what's happening globally in this space. And obviously touched on the Greens and Teal's influence on Parliament. Sustainability is going to continue to be a major factor that we'll have to address. However, I think that we are really well placed as an industry to tell that story and to demonstrate what farmers are doing in this space. And it means that we've got to utilise our data in a really efficient and effective and coordinated way so that we can be on the front foot and tell the story to government before they go and regulate, like they did in the Netherlands. That came as a huge surprise to the farmers over there. We're not in that space. We don't want to be in that space, but I think we can collectively put forward our data and our performance in terms of environmental management to get the balance right in an environmental sense. Water, I'll try and flick over that one. That one's going to be a challenge. The government's committed to getting back that 450 gigalitres, which will mean something to some to more in this room than others. But the Murray-Darling Basin will be a challenge. Luckily, there's a lot of water flowing around, which will make the discussion a little bit easier. Biosecurity, major threat, major issue, obviously, with not only foot and mouth, but lumpy skin and varroa mite and capra beetle and leaf miner and all these other things. Our view is that there is not a good enough system, coordination, cooperation between the states and Commonwealth, nor is there a sustainable funding model. We don't spend enough on biosecurity in this country, and the new government has committed to developing a sustainable funding model. It's not all about dollars, it's about coordination. So it's a major issue. Obviously, most people in this room will have followed it closely, the foot and mouth disease, and we've been working really closely with government trying to get more measures in place, which they are doing and have done, which is good. Just a minute or two left to go. I just thought I'd give a brief update on we're attending the Jobs Summit on Thursday. Probably most of you are like me, if not a bit sick of it. It's coming thick and fast about what's going to happen on Thursday and Friday at this Jobs Summit. It's a good thing that the government's doing it because obviously we need to talk about it. It's not just agriculture. Luckily, we have had an agriculture workforce strategy completed by the previous government just last year. So we're better placed than most sectors in terms of what we need to do to address the labour issue. The 3 or 4 things that we'll be throwing on the table on Thursday, and there's 100 people at this summit. It'll be heavily stacked with employee organisations. There'll be some employer organisations, business groups. NFF has got a seat there, so Fiona will be around the table with state ministers and other people, and she'll be representing the ag sector right across the country. And PPSA, GPSA, Livestock SA have all had input into that paper, and they're the 3 or 4 things that will be putting forward. Simplifying the industrial relations system, getting more people into this country more quickly, focusing on ag-specific jobs. The visa system is not focused on agriculture, they're focused on economic development or holiday regimes for backpackers, and they are fine. They just don't target the agricultural workforce issue that we've seen in this country for a couple of decades. They're retrofitted for agriculture, and that's always been our challenge. We also do need to do more in the vocational education space. It's focused on non-agricultural jobs, urban focus, so we need to do more to get recognition of the skills that are required in agriculture. And it's not just low-skilled, it's semi-skilled and high-skilled, as most people in this room will know. And we've got to do some more work about attracting people to the industry, demonstrating what great jobs there are. I think the Minister talked about it earlier this morning. People don't see agriculture as a career, unfortunately. They go and do finance or law or marketing or communications, and they don't think there's a job for them in agriculture. And I'm probably right out of time, but one anecdote I like to say is that my kids have just finished year 12, but when they go to, and I see them go to career summits and career nights and things, there's hairdressing, apprenticeships, accounting, finance, law, marketing, no farming, no agriculture. I got an email from my school to say, if any people are in these jobs, can you come and do a stall at a careers night? Look down the list, no agriculture. It's a worry. We're not even in the picture. We don't get asked to come to these career nights. So luckily I went and bought a thing of cotton and some sunflowers and some apples and oranges and set up my own stall at this school and just said, who's interested in food and fibre? It's a great industry, there's great jobs, there's plenty of jobs. You don't have to sit on a tractor if you don't want to. So we've got to do some basic things and more things in that space. So I'm probably out of time, but thank you very much for having me. I hope that was of some interest in terms of where we're going on the $100 billion target. And I don't know if we've got any time for questions, but happy to take any if there are any. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. And just a little bit of housekeeping. Tony and I are vertically blessed. We can go up this way, but the stairs for presenters, please try and come up that side. The question, there's a couple of important ones that have been sitting up on the list here in our app we've got for questions. Be sure, look in your guide if you want to ask questions. You haven't caught the instruction on that. What is the farmer wellbeing gap that NFF hopes to close? Was there a mention of that in your presentation?
I don't recall wellbeing, but in the pillars, people and communities. It's one of the areas, to be honest, that we don't do enough on, and we haven't. It's in the roadmap, but we don't actually do a lot on mental health or health for farmers. It's a bit of a weak spot for us, a blank spot. We do work with a whole range of organisations that do work in this space, but we know how much of an issue mental health and rural health is. I suppose what we do is work with some of those other regional health organisations, rural doctors and flying doctors and those sorts of things to try and address it. But it is a little bit of a weak spot.
Tony, important question people are raising about the Farmers Federation's role for Ag at COP27,
yep.
The Global Climate Change Conference, about particularly on global sustainability as the discussion evolves. What's the plan for November?
Yep. Good question. So at the previous COPs, and I've not been to one, but they're a bit of a circus as I understand. There's thousands and thousands of people trying to get a presence and get their issues put forward. At the last one in Scotland, can't think where it was exactly. Glasgow, sorry. The feedback was that agriculture copped a bit of a hiding around what it's doing or not doing. So for this one, we are going to have a presence there when we've talked to Prime Minister's office and Chris Bowen's office about having a coordinated, combined government and industry representation at COP in Egypt in about the 10th of November. To make sure that people know that agriculture is doing some good things and we're not not wanting to be the carbon sink, and we're not the worst child in the room in terms of performance on sustainability. So we're actually trying to get on the front foot, as busy and as hectic as those meetings can be. Agriculture and Australian agriculture and Australian government will have a joint presence there to demonstrate what it is that we're doing, so they don't run red meat or agriculture out of town in any future sessions. So definitely going to have a presence there.
I'll ask one more question, and I'll ask it as framed because we've got to keep cracking along. Verbatim, the question says, New Zealand farmers have decided, invert quotes, to pay for their so-called carbon emissions thanks to their government. How can we stop the same happening here? ? Terrible outcome.
Yes, I've been watching that. Interestingly, that the New Zealand Federated Farmers, who we talked to a little bit, my understanding was that they either supported it or didn't mind that approach. So that was, I thought, interesting. So what do we do about it? We get on the front foot and, like we're doing, and try and demonstrate what gains and technology is being implemented to reduce emissions, not only from animals, but also from ag production. And I do genuinely think we've got a great story to tell, and technology will help us be positive and be constructive in that discussion. Yes, there's some challenges, no doubt. But I do feel like if we can get our data and our messaging and our networks right, we've got a good story to tell in that space.
Thanks, Tony. There's a comment that was put in through the questions I think is a good way to sum up. It was a bold plan for the Farmers Federation to set and an incredibly unifying true north for all participants to rally behind and get on board. Well done, NFF. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. You're on the ball already. Advocacy is a critical tool for our industries to successfully navigate through economic upheaval and social shifts. The Farmers Federation recently commissioned the Australian Farm Institute to consult with members to develop a strategic roadmap for the ag industry. And representing the AFI today is General Manager Katie McRobert. Katie is experienced in the fields of policy research, editing, communications and project management, and has been part of the Farm Institute team since late 2017. There is more about her in your program. In the interest of brevity and cracking on with it, Katie's going to speak with us about the future of ag advocacy and ensuring our voice is heard. Please welcome Katie.
There we go. I've made the joke before that Tony Mahar is someone I look up to. I'm pleased to be up on a stage today so you can all look up to me. That's nice to have the microphone in the right place there. So we've had the setup there. I'll just have a very quick introduction for people who aren't aware of the Australian Farm Institute. To be really reductive about it, it's an independent think tank that focuses on the social and economic well-being of Australian farmers and the farm industry. So it looks at issues primarily around the sustainability of the industry, and as we've heard today, that sustainability doesn't just mean environmental, it takes in a lot of things about the way the industry is conducted, about profitability, about long-term prospects for the industry. So Tony's set us up well here with the 2030 roadmap, which sets out some really big goals for the industry. Also, as Tony's mentioned, some really big challenges as well. And that puts a lot of pressure on agriculture to be at its peak capability. To be able to be at peak capability, you need the appropriate structures in place to deliver on that. So NFF has asked the Farm Institute to look at whether or not ag advocacy is fit for purpose in a world that's quite different from when these systems were first set up. So it's fairly safe to say that the agricultural advocacy organisations operating today are largely legacy systems. They were set up in a particular way to address particular problems, and they haven't necessarily evolved with the landscape around them. So that's what we're looking at with this project. So the definition of advocacy is pretty clear. You can hopefully see that. It's maybe a little bit too small, so I'll read out some of the salient points. To advocate is to plead in favour of or speak on behalf of someone or a position or a group. That's what advocacy is. That's pretty straightforward. The problem, though, if we park that for a second, is that it's a well-known tenet of business that structure should follow strategy, not the other way around. If you build a structure first with no clear idea of what you're doing that for or what the outcomes of that structure are going to be, the whole thing's going to fall over pretty quickly. Yet, most people within agricultural advocacy narrow in on the what and the how, on what's going on, what are the activities, how are we doing this, what are the processes that are leading us to things, without actually looking at the why, at the purpose at the centre of what's going on here. And that can lead to a really myopic view of advocacy. As an example, there's a list there, which is not a comprehensive list, it's just an example list, of some of the activities that occur within advocacy organisations around Australia and around the world. In agriculture, almost exclusively, people focus in on one activity. They focus in largely on lobbying, and they don't necessarily ignore the other ones, but they don't give them focus and they don't give them due consideration about how they might impact what's going on in advocacy. So a bit of background to the project itself, what we did and what we found out. There's a discussion paper that was distributed for comment and questions. We undertook some key informant interviews, that's what KII stands for. We did 41 interviews across 29 organisations in Australian advocacy under Chatham House rules. So people were very open with us, people spoke very freely about both the challenges and the opportunities and the benefits and the problems of their organisations. We also undertook a survey of 755, I think, stakeholders, which is not just people within advocacy organisations. It was very evenly split between half and half, people who were members, people who were not, but people who were all involved in agriculture. Then we analysed what we had. We did a desktop review, which meant we just read a whole lot of reports and looked into a lot of previous work, particularly in the past 5 years. And we developed some case studies, and I'd like to say case studies of how advocacy works well and how it falls over. Mostly they're about where it's falling over, but we've got some case studies as well. And then we've started a series of workshops where we're looking at strategy mapping for organisations to try and help them look towards a different future. So some of the early findings, we actually came up with a whole lot of questions in that first stage. So when we were undertaking these interviews and when we had the discussion paper out for circulation, questions kept cropping up again and again, even though we asked different people from different angles. Does advocacy have a clearly stated purpose? Who is it representing? Is it standing on a burning platform? A lot of people asked us, is there an urgent case for change? Do we need to change tomorrow or yesterday? Or is this something that we can afford to deal with in the longer term? Are poor inter-organisational relationships undermining performance? And that's about the way organisations relate to each other as opposed to relationships within the organisation. Is the current model effective for community trust matters, which are increasingly important? And how does agricultural advocacy compare to peers? So compare to other advocate organisations. At a very high level, the report will be coming out as soon as I stop giving presentations and can have some time back at the keyboard to finish writing. The findings are that an absence of purpose about what benefits advocacy can bring back to those members and stakeholders is lacking across most organisations. There's also a lack of clarity about who advocacy is representing. Is it representing members? Is it representing the whole industry? Is it looking at supply chain? Is it focused on consumers? There's quite a conflation of understanding there. There's significant financial pressure on many organisations. If you look at a proportion of farm businesses in Australia, then we have quite low levels of membership amongst lots of the state farming organisations, also some of the membership-based commodity organisations. And there's a great deal of capability within agricultural advocacy, but that's very clearly locked into silos and there's not a lot of collaboration. Of course, we do need different structures for public advocacy than we do for political advocacy, but most agricultural systems are set up more for that legacy system of political advocacy. So a very quick run through the survey. How important are agricultural advocacy organisations? Very important. And keeping in mind these are people who are both members and non-members. They all thought that advocacy still has a lot of importance and largely a great deal of credibility. So a little bit more skewed towards pretty credible to very credible, but most people said very important. Who does agricultural advocacy represent? All farmers, not the members of the organisations, absolutely all farmers. And what's the main purpose of advocacy? Again, that's a little bit small for you to read up the back there, but overall it's to speak on behalf of farmers to the community, to develop favourable policies, it's a bit small for me to read as well, and to promote the industry's needs to political representatives. So that's quite clear. There are some very clear findings from the surveys and not many huge surprises, to be honest. What's not clear is who should be doing this and how they should be doing it. This is an incomplete list of agricultural advocacy organisations in Australia. And I don't want to get into arguments about whether or not these people are advocates or not advocates. They all self-identify as advocacy organisations, which means they count as advocacy organisations. That's what they think they do. We stopped counting at 251 because we had other things we were trying to do for the report. We'll go back and try and finish this off before we hand it over to NFF later on. Organisations view themselves as individual entities with unique agendas. All of these people do. But they're all part of a system. And systems work because they're people working together for a common cause. The problem with having a great number of organisations is not that there is too many. Who's to say how many is the right number? The problem is that this number of organisations, without some sort of sense of how they work together, confuses your stakeholders. And what we heard time and time again in the interviews that we conducted with the targets of advocacy, so we're talking about people in political positions or people in departments or people who make decisions on behalf of the industry, they're confused about who they should be listening to or who they should be asking questions of, because there's a lot going on here. Should there be rationalisation of this number? Probably yes, but it's not up to an external person to come in and say, cut out the ones in the middle, tack these two together, these ones look like they belong together. For it to work, for rationalisation to work, and for representation to still matter to the people who are members of these organisations, this has to be a self-assessment process. And organisations need to look at themselves with proper perspective and find their place in the ecosystem and where they can work together with organisations. Some of them might need to pack up and fold in and say, look, I'm just duplicating work that someone across the fence is doing. I don't need to be doing that. Others could say, look, my strength is over here, your strength is over there. Perhaps we could work together for a better outcome. And maybe you'd form an alliance. Maybe some of them might actually merge in together. But that has to happen within the organisational ecosystem itself. So there are a few ways you can look at this. One way is to look above and below the waterline using the iceberg analogy. So again, using that list, which is just an indicative list, there might be things missing off here, to think about what activities are above the waterline, what do people see that you do, or what do people think an organisation does, and what else does it do that sits below the waterline. It seems like a fairly obvious exercise. Probably a lot of you are looking at that going, well, it's pretty easy. I would put these 3 boxes up the top, the other 3 boxes down the bottom, and delete those boxes that I don't like. For agricultural advocacy, it's pretty easy because you have a fairly consistent view of what advocacy looks like, but it's not the same across other advocacy organisations. So if we have a look at the RSPCA, which is an advocacy group, they put activism up above the waterline. That's what people see that they do. Accountability is what's written on all of their websites and all of their purpose statements. That's what's above the waterline for RSPCA. For the Pharmacy Guild of Australia, which has been described as the most successful lobby group you've never heard of, they put negotiation relationships up the top. Now, this is a really powerful group, very, very powerful. I would say whatever they ask for, they get, but they don't ask. They make demands to the government, and the government says, okay, because they are so well organised and the relationships are so strong that they just set the tone for pharmacists around Australia. But they don't do communication, they don't do activism, they don't really do democracy that well either. They do negotiation and they do behind the scenes relationships, but they're still a very successful advocacy group. Choice is another advocacy, consumer advocacy group. They do member services, they do research. Centre for Food Integrity, you can come and ask Deanna more about this at lunchtime and she can tell me which bits of this I might have gotten wrong. But this is a group based in Canada and North America which looks at advocating for farmers and consumers of food and fibre, but they focus more on analysis and communication, less on that negotiation, less on accountability, certainly not on lobbying or activism. And then you've got the National Farmers Federation, which most people we spoke to said is a lobby group. They describe themselves as a leadership group, and they've got these other things that sit below the waterline. Now, what we're saying here is not that NFF is doing it wrong or that any other agricultural organisation is doing it wrong, but that you need to consider there are different ways to do advocacy than the one way that all of those 251 organisations are trying to do it. I forgot I put this in early this morning. So this is the problem. You've got lots of icebergs all trying to do the same thing, crowding up the space, and that's where you get the confusion from the stakeholders. And I was likening it to my mind early this morning when I couldn't sleep, that you've got a whole lot of buskers all competing for the same street corner, or you've got one-man bands trying to do everything for everybody all the time, instead of having a whole group of people who know their part within the system, who are contributing to make a more harmonious outcome for everybody. So, why is this important? There is a global trend to decline in membership organisations. This is a present danger to agricultural advocacy. If you ignore the trend, what happens is the trend can become an accelerating downward spiral really quickly. If membership starts to fall and revenue declines, the first thing that's easy to do is downsize your staff a little bit, which then impacts on your services and they decline a little bit. If your services are down, you're going to get a little less membership the next year. And if your membership declines, you're going to downsize a bit more and your services are going to get impacted. Very quickly, that just becomes a very slippery slope that you can't climb back out of, and it leads to what we famously call the boiling frog scenario, where things have changed before you notice they did and now it's too late. The world is changing around agricultural advocacy, but the systems that serve that advocacy are not changing fast enough. As an example, and I've deliberately cut off which organisations these are, just one second. It was outside the scope of the project to do a full economic analysis, but we did pretty much a back-of-the-envelope calculation on a few of the revenue reports that we could find online. There's not that many of them, to be honest. And looking at just 5 organisations, there's a clear downward trend in all but one, and the one that's an upward trend is only reported on the past 3 years. So we can't actually say if it's a genuine upward trend or a good couple of years. There is a trend to declining revenue across agricultural advocacy membership, and for some organisations it's very steep and a very urgent issue. For others it's just a general downward decline, but as you all know from business, you're all business people, if it's a downward decline you need to know why and you need to intervene. So the complexity and the inefficiency of models in the Australian advocacy system is what's undermining organisational purpose. It's very difficult to make an impact in what's an increasingly noisy media ecosystem. Things have changed so dramatically in the past few years, and I could have put up a whole lot of graphs about how many people are now on YouTube, on Facebook, on TikTok. You all know that social media has changed the way that people communicate and interact, and that's not to say that advocates need to get out there on TikTok next week and that way it'll fix the problem. It's just to reframe the way that you think about how you communicate and what your systems are set up to serve. There's also, around the world, a exponentially growing divide between urban and rural communities. So it's not nearly as dramatic in Australia, which is why I didn't put the graph up. It looks nicer if it's a big spike in between the two. But that divide is growing, and that's why it's ever more important that agricultural advocacy can speak up for those people and make sure that people making the decisions are also aware of what's happening on the ground. So, ag advocacy needs to grow lizard feet. Rather than being a boiled frog, it needs to respond like this hardy green anole. This little lizard's an evolutionary marvel which responded to an invasive threat first by modifying its behaviour and then changing its actual physical structure at an astonishing rate. In short, brown anoles moved into the island on where this green anole lived. It had to get up higher to get away from those guys. It moved to higher branches and developed larger pads and sticky toes in just 20 generations, which for a lizard is a really short period of time. And so we're saying that ag advocacy needs to stop thinking of itself as a boiling frog and consider instead how it would grow lizard feet. How would you do this, though? We're suggesting that, as much as it sounds like an abstract thing, we should take a systems thinking approach to this problem. Systems thinking has a whole academic lost for words. There's a whole lot of literature on systems thinking and what it means and how you can apply it, but there's some really simple tools of trade that are very effective in rethinking how you work within this system and what your place is and whether or not you're serving the purpose you were set up to serve. Some of those include recognising responsibility for your contribution to the issue. There's a lot of well-intentioned contributions to a problem that you can recognise through systems thinking, challenging mental models and stepping outside those comfort zones, and looking at things like ecosystem mapping, which would be just putting yourself within that big system of all those other 250 organisations, but also the people that you're trying to speak to. There are different ways you can draw ecosystem maps, but those are about clarifying those connections between organisations and groups and individuals, looking for where there are duplications or opportunities for collaboration, and it's about allocating the resources in the system more effectively. Of course, you can go back to that iceberg idea where you're looking at the activities and whether or not these activities that you undertake are in line with your stakeholders' perceptions of what you do or what you should be doing, and if not, why not? And there are things like stocks and flows diagrams, which is again about using resources. So this looks really complicated, but from a business standpoint, it's all about thinking in the resources that go into your business or model or organisation, how those translate to inputs which lead to the activities which create outputs which lead to the outcomes you want to get to the goal, but then how you're reinvesting back into those so that the system keeps on flowing around. If you don't reinvest, and you as farmers know this better than anybody, if you take things out of a system but you don't replace them back into the system, it falls over pretty quickly. But we don't think about advocacy in that way. We think about it as just it does itself, it keeps serving itself without looking at the points of intervention in the system where we need to decide what capitals are we using? Are we using too much of our financial capital? Are we not using our human capital properly? Do we have intellectual capital that we could leverage better? And if so, are we reinvesting back into those capitals so that we can keep on using them for years to come? So for advocacy, it's a bit of a spoiler alert, it's people. It's pretty straightforward. It seems like a really obvious point to make, but it's still dramatically overlooked within most organisations. People make or break advocacy, and advocacy can make or break people. Advocacy organisations don't make stuff, they do stuff. That human capital is by far the most valuable of all of the capitals that go into a system, yet it's treated as though human capital exists to serve the organisation's functions instead of the other way around. It's absolutely vital that advocates think about investing in their human capital to change that mindset from being counterproductive and self-perpetuating some of those issues, and looking at points of intervention like intrinsic rewards. Instead of paying people more money, have you made sure that their rewards are things that they value, things that they make them feel special and part of something bigger? Are you looking after people's mental health? It's easy enough to ask, are you okay? But do you actually have systems in place to look after this? The number of people who've been broken by advocacy systems is quite extraordinary. I'm sure you all know them. Are you looking after development within the organisation? Have you got succession plans in place? And are you investing in the skill sets that people actually genuinely need to serve that organisation well and in turn be served by that organisation? So you get all that sort of information, you put it together in an overarching impact map, and I won't go through this in detail, we can maybe send it around later for people to look at, but an impact map is about establishing a clear challenge and looking to a very clear goal, and then in between that, deciding what the activities are that you need to make the changes to create the outputs which lead to the outcomes which get you to that goal. And if you don't have a focus on this goal at the end, all the things in the middle will fall over very, very fast. So for the project, we're also looking at developing a strategy map for the National Farmers Federation, which is just a more detailed version of that impact map and looks at particular organisational activities, measures, targets, initiatives that you can undertake to get yourself to that broad goal. But it's just a starting point. A strategy map like this doesn't solve anything unless NFF and other advocacy organisations take ownership of this process, self-analyse where they fit within that system and what their purpose is, and then commit to changes big and small. There won't be that systematic transformation that we need. So only then can advocacy organisations be confident that they're fit for purpose, that they're making the best use of and investing back into the capital resources that make it all work, with assurance that their actions are helping to create a sustainable future, not for themselves, not to be self-perpetuating, but for the systems in which they operate and for the people for whom they advocate. And that's it.
Thanks, Katie. Have a good drink of water there. I feel like you've gone and looked under the bonnet of all the advocacy organisations that are like tractors. You've sort of gone and looked at all the tech specs there, and that's probably a good way to lead into our first question. Well, I'll have a couple and then keep moving. Having looked at these advocacy organisations in agribusiness, is there a group or an industry or a state where advocacy is done well? You know, what vehicle, what tractor of advocacy is the best one on the market?
Look, there'll be case studies in the report that look into that in more detail. I wouldn't say that there's any one organisation that is doing everything well, that is the gold standard, the model. There are certainly elements of different organisations. You know, not everyone's failing, but everybody needs to at least pay attention to whether or not they are failing. But there are elements from different organisations that are successful. Some of them might be short-term successful, and maybe we'll be calling that out as well in some of the case studies. But yeah, there's no gold standard at this stage.
Very well done. Look out for the report. That's the short answer. All right, one last question. Here in South Australia, we do have some key differences to other states where we have producer levies supporting associations under legislation like PIFs. Did you look into that in your review?
We didn't look too much at the actual funding of advocacy because our brief was to look at the purpose and whether or not the structures are serving the purpose. In the survey, we did ask people how advocacy should be funded, and there were some surprises there. There are a surprisingly large number of people who said levies are a great way to fund advocacy, and we didn't really expect that. So it is different, and there'll be a little bit of light commentary in the report on that, but yeah, I'm not sure quite what my role there is to answer that.
Very good. You've got people glued and watching for that report when it comes out. Thanks, Katie. Just to hang about there for a second.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay.
Please thank Katie McRobert. All right, we're going to move on to our panel session shortly, and just bear with us while we do a little bit of moving around here on the stage. Our panel is going to be joining us shortly on the stage. I feel like paraphrasing the Top Gun movie. I feel a need to succeed. What does South Australian agriculture need to succeed? And our panel members are going to be our flight crew for this question session. Joining us up on stage will be Joe Keynes, the President of Livestock SA and a farmer at Cannington, Adrian McCabe, the re-elected Chair of Grain Producers SA and farmer at Hamley Bridge, Dr. Stephen Lee, Director of the SA Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub, otherwise known as the SA Drought Hub. And we welcome back to the stage Paul Dowler from the Regional Investment Corporation. So, gentlemen, if I've got this right, we'll get everything moving and set up and we'll get you up here and begin our session. All right, thank you very much. Now, Joe, I believe we're going to have a short presentation from each of you, if I've got this correct. Short 3 or 4 minute presentation from each, just on this question, what does South Australian agriculture need to succeed? Take it away, Joe.
We got it going? Yeah. Yes, I actually, I had some ideas yesterday and last night, and they've all gone out the window. Really what we've seen and heard from today has been some fantastic information, and I'm starting to distill it. Livestock SA, 10 years old, out of the ashes of the South Australian Farmers Federation. We're at the crossroads, I think, and we're just looking at our organisation. So Katie's presentation around how we do advocacy better is something that our board will need to take on board, and our organisation's going to have to develop. So that'll help succeed in the advocacy space. What I was thinking about is we need to, and this conference is all around sustainability, and we've had lots of discussions around sustainability before, and we'll have it afterwards. I guess when I look at agriculture, and I think we've heard some commentary around, we're actually part of the problem for greenhouse and climate change and all of that. We're the problem in a large degree, and we're seen as that by the larger community. And Tony talked about we've got to make sure that we advocate on behalf of our producers that we are actually also part of the solution. And I think we need to really embrace that. And, you know, it does present us with some challenges, because I know in the world of livestock, we're being challenged by our markets, by our retailers, to say we don't want mulesed wool, and that's starting to become an emerging aspect. But if we talk about animal welfare, that sounds like the best solution, but there are actually environments in South Australia and animals in South Australia that if we didn't mule them, that would be the worst outcome. So we actually have a challenge. Our markets are telling us one thing, that would be absolutely, could be the worst animal welfare outcome that you know, with fly-blown sheep and all of that. So I think that's really important that we actually really invigorate that animal welfare area, and then obviously the biosecurity, our environmental credentials, all of those aspects are actually going to ensure that we succeed. So we've heard some really high level and really fantastic presentations today. I guess the challenge for us in agriculture is to how do we actually, we've got, I don't know, 200 people here, odd 300 is it? Anyway, of our membership, there's 3,100 sitting at home, not understanding and not getting a sense of what we're doing. So how do we actually translate all of the learnings that we're hearing now back to on ground? And that's probably, and get that adopted. And I think that's a real challenge. I know the Drought Hub and Stephen will talk about that. I heard some really fantastic projects they've got that are hitting the ground. We've got to do more of that. Is that a role of an advocacy body? Is that a role of government? Is that a role of our RDCs? There is a range. I think it's a collaboration. We've got to continue those discussions as a group and ensure that we actually do meet the targets of our own blueprints in South Australia, our livestock, our sheep and cattle blueprints, but also feed into the national blueprint.
Thanks, Joe. Adrian, some of our themes at this conference are sustainability, innovation, business management and building skills for a prosperous future. So what are Grain Producers SA doing to help grain growers succeed in those areas?
So sustainability is a real opportunity for South Australian growers. Apologies to people in the state, but we're going to win this argument. I think there's some real opportunities for South Australian growers here. We can do it really well. We've got a good story to tell. So nationally, our board contributes to the GPA, Grain Producers Australia Policy Council. We also inform the Grain Growers Limited Grain Sustainability Framework, which is being developed at this stage. And then we also have involvement with the NFF, obviously, through Primary Producers SA. So we've seen the need to look at the gaps in South Australia as far as the national rollout as well as the international process. So we developed our own task force to have a look at, you know, our unique place in South Australia. So we've met 3 times so far. First was a scoping session on what the environment looks like, both nationally and internationally. Second was our unique soils and the emissions ways and how we calculate them in South Australia. So what fell out of the CSIRO report, the work done by the GRDC, that didn't fit the South Australian grain growers. And the third was, what does our industry and the banks want out of sustainability in the grain system, which plays into livestock, plays into manufacturers. So what actually do they want? What are they talking about? How are they seeing us interact with them? And that was a really interesting session, and that was our last one. So what came out of the last one to look forward is baseline emissions. Calculate your baseline emissions. We need to know where South Australian growers are. So that was a critical message. Verification, audit process, and a stackable approach, which must include the ISCC. So those messages were really clear out of the last one. So that's where we're sitting. They're the questions we're posing, and to find our unique position. So as far as innovation goes, farming will always continue to innovate, and we'll adapt to our challenges that we face, and this is obviously one of them. We see the multinational agri-corporations doing a lot of things already, so we don't need to be in that space, but we need to know what they're doing. GPSA fought hard to win the right to grow GM. Interesting to note that GM technology is probably nearly now superseded by the new genetically engineered traits. So we need to be in front of that. We need to be articulating to the wider community how good they are and how safe they are, obviously. Driverless tractor capacity is arriving on our shores, and note Colin Bettles at the back doing a lot of work, the GPA in that area, to try and get that licensing. So that technology is coming, it's arriving. Can we use it yet? No, but we need to know how and how it's licensed. So that's happening. Below the soils, South Australia is doing some really innovative stuff with plant phenomics and science in South Australia. Nitrogen inhibitors is a big one coming. It's one we need to be aware of. We need to be acceptance of. It's the low-hanging fruit for emissions for grain producers. Watch this space. There's a lot of talk about it on the national stage. Hopefully it's affordable and beneficial to growers, but that's one we need to be ahead of as well. And of course also in South Australia we've got this great money being poured into the plant protein world. So that's a really cool one for grain growers, and it's a really great innovation by both the South Australian federal government and Thomas Foods have backed that one massively. So some really big innovations coming around the corner. It's all exciting. It's all plus for South Australian grain growers, but there's a bit of work to do and a bit of work behind the scenes. Connectivity with this is still a major problem for farmers, so we haven't dropped that one off. We get it. We know there's not much point talking about auditability, traceability when we can't get mobile phone service. So that is absolutely critical, and we hear it, and we'll continue to push for that one. Business management and building skills for the future. We've done some work in this in the last 12 months and continue to do so. We've continued to help by providing workshops in the guide to the market, your grain, hit your spray target campaign. That's going to need to be revamped. It's going to need to be uploaded. We need to get on top of this one as far as chemical stewardship and sustainability. We've really got to get this one ramped up and done better. And Shane Gale has continued to roll out across the state heavy vehicle education workshops, which have been excellent and great work by Shane. He's also about to roll out ag vehicle on road workshops. So some really good stuff done by our staff who continue to work really hard behind the scenes. We recently did a grower survey on sustainability. It was a couple of interesting phone calls back on that one, some pushback, but we're unashamedly trying to find out where growers are in this space, what they're thinking, what they're doing, are we engaged, what education do we need to roll out, where are the gaps, what do they want to know. So unashamedly about that. There was no pre-concept behind it, but you know, we've got a place to roll on your behalf to talk to government, and that's what that information's for. Labour, we know, is a major constraint in the rural industry. Obviously working with the NFF. Tony, you'll be glad to know that at your Jomps conference we have a mixed farmer from the mid-north who will be the MC, so I'll give you the phone number. You'll be right. We've got you back. The Ag Minister obviously mentioned that today, and that's through PPSA and our involvement with the newly funded PPSA and Professor Simon Maddox. But we do need to pivot in this world to be a more inclusive and a cohesive industry, so we become an employer of choice. So that's a real target for us as GPSA as well.
Great, thanks Adrian. And there's some questions already popping in on inclusivity. Don't forget, look in your guide there, about 3 pages in from the back, scan the code, and not only put your question in, if you can't think of a question, at least vote for the ones others have put forward, so we make sure we ask the question you're all burning to hear. All right, we'll move to Dr. Stephen Lee on the question of resilience and preparing for drought. Is South Australia moving in the right direction?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In terms of where we are and as a state, what do we need to do to succeed? We've got the right key ingredient, people. We've got good people, great people, and the other part, really fantastic collaborative intent. I think that's probably without parallel across Australia. So in terms of the Drought Hub, our mission's around creating measurable impact across South Australia's farming systems, across our farms, around improved drought resilience and improved farm productivity, both in good years but also in the tougher seasons. What we're doing is working with a myriad of stakeholders. We've got 60 hub members, including Livestock SA, Grain Producers SA and PPSA, but also the farming systems groups and landscape boards of South Australia and industry service providers, to set priorities, identify the key themes and areas where we can make effective change on farm, measurable change on farm, and then implement the trials and the demonstration sites that can show that. So this morning we heard a lot about what's next around the corner from a couple of outstanding cooperative research centres, CRCs. Our next iteration of the hub will be hopefully taking their research outcomes and helping apply them effectively on farms across SA. In terms of where we're at, I had the good fortune of hosting the Future Drought Fund Hubs Advisory Committee in South Australia last week. We were able to take the Hubs Advisory Committee to 5 commercial farms right across the Barossa Valley, Murray Plains and the Mallee to show them the types of trials we're working on around water security, around feed-based management, around time of sowing, around efficient fertiliser use, to make the best of the resources we have available as farmers, or to help farmers make the best use of their resources. All of those projects were built around what did the farmers, the local farming systems group want, what collaboration could be achieved, and what innovation could come. So when we think about resilience isn't about hunkering down and getting through the event. Effective resilience is about innovating out of it. And that's where the Drought Hub's really positioned to take the research outcomes that we know exist and then help farmers innovate out of challenging situations, whether it's lack of feed and things like that. From a sustainability perspective, a lot of these projects have multiple benefits. They're productivity benefits, economic benefits, landscape stewardship benefits, improvements to the soil, often product quality benefits at the same time, or animal welfare improvements as well, and animal wellbeing in terms of confinement feeding. So that's the upside. The challenge we've got is, as Joe alluded to, we're reaching a lot of farmers through the farming systems groups, but not everyone. The hub is there to try and make a measurable difference across industry, not just for the top 20%. So that's where I'm taking the challenge next, is making sure that these projects are reaching through industry.
All right, thanks, Stephen. And lastly, Paul, we will go to questions. We've got some great questions coming in here. Paul Dowler from the Platinum sponsor for today, Regional Investment Corporation. You're doing some great work and talked about sustainability. How have you seen farmers adapt to the adverse conditions they've been confronted with?
I think just before that, if you look at what are the opportunities that are out there, and then what are we doing with, say, the threats that we've got. If we look at the opportunities, and last night, a stat that came and is just so strong was 0.5% involved in agriculture, producing for 99.5% of the world. And if you look at that, I think it's something that's unrivaled in any other sort of industry. Coupled with that, then, if you look at some of the risks which we're dealing with, in particular around, say, biosecurity, which is the one that's certainly on everybody's mind, and how we therefore mitigate it. From our perspective at the Regional Investment Corporation, one of the key things is around simply how you finance the future. And there is a bright future for agriculture. There are some headwinds, as was presented to us, and it's about how do you invest appropriately to be able to therefore mitigate those risks and take best opportunity of those opportunities that are there. For what we're seeing with the Investment Corporation, and our loans are available for a range of purposes. It's one flat rate of interest, no matter whether you're buying livestock, machinery or land, which is relatively unique. Probably worth noting that we're not there to compete with banks, we're there to support what banks do. And therefore what we want to do is to be able to work in partnership to make sure that people have access to finance. One of the key things I think to look at, how do we succeed in the future, in the end is about access to capital markets that allows us to invest in what we need to invest in. In terms of what we see for the Investment Corporation, there's a number of things. Certainly early times it was around simply refinancing of existing loans to be able to get cash flows such that they could therefore then support everyday operations. But we're seeing increasingly the use of farm investment where they are now investing in things which will sustain them and have them prepared for the next drought. So the sorts of things which they're doing can be a range of things. It's around water security, water storage, how they can better use water, how they manage better livestock systems, and one big one that seems to be coming through, of course, then naturally is how they then start to think about scaling up through perhaps buying of additional land and looking at succession planning as well, so that we can support then the next generation as they come forward.
All right, thank you, Paul. Now we'll go to the questions, and this panel is a poor snapshot at this point in time on the diversity on the gender basis in agriculture, but there are other panels and other presenters we've had so far with some women on board, but that has been the top rating question so far. Is diversity a factor in sustainability? Perhaps women could have a voice in determining what SA Ag needs to succeed to. Adrian, I'm giving that to you.
Certainly, and we have a female minister, for instance, and it was really impressive, and also have a female minister for the environment, both running agriculture effectively. So, absolutely, we're again unashamedly promoting on our board. We hope we've got that diversity pretty right. Yep, we certainly do need a chair of GPSA to be a woman in the very near future. Absolutely.
You're dropping a bombshell there, Adrian?
Could have voted me. Could have happened yesterday. Actually, it would have been really good. But no, I think it's sensible. And interestingly, to up at Sydney to sit in the room around the sustainability workshop with the Grain Growers Limited, I would have thought that room was about 45 women to men. I think it is happening around the place. I look out in this room today, and it's changing gradually. I think the challenge for us as GPSA, though, is to become, as far as a farm operations type group, is to get certainly women more involved, and it's also an age group thing as well. It's not just gender as far as diversity. It's also non-English speaking people. I mean, let's not limit it to what we're not doing particularly well at the moment. So yeah, absolutely. And I think I mentioned that the last bit. Our board is actively starting to look down that space to see how we pivot and how we do that better. What the workspace looks like on an actual farm. You know, are there amenities? Are there levers? Are there tools to enable a different sort of workforce than what's been there? We have to do it because we want families to live in rural areas and be involved in it. I'd argue that it's actually really holding back our industry at the moment. It's probably holding back the advancements of sustainability. People are very busy out working on their business. In their business, we actually need people that are working on their business to be articulating them as farmers and driving agricultural businesses. So, yeah, certainly not walking away for that. And I think our board has been real, as far as our strategic planning is going, has really identified that as a key issue for us.
Now, I'll stay on that topic and I'll throw it open to the panel as a broader question. Are there good models or ways to improve inclusivity?
I think if I can just reflect on the Investment Corporation, a unique space that we're in, we've got 100% of our board as women. So if you think about how frequent does that occur, it's not very frequent, but 100% of our board is women. 100% and 50% of our executive leadership team is women. And we've been quite conscious about making sure there is that element of inclusion. And I think it's important that that's not something which comes as quotas or anything like that. It's they are there because they are the best, and they are the most suitable for us. I think we just heard just recently, the talk on advocacy, and I think for agriculture as a whole, to be more appealing. And if you think about, again, that 99.5% of people who aren't us but are relying upon us, it's critical that we've got diversity across all sectors, cultural divide, etc., to be able to make sure we've got the right advocacy for what we do and what we do well.
Stephen, were you going to say something on that?
Yeah, certainly. So from a Drought Hub perspective, our advisory board has very close to gender neutrality. Our staff does as well. In terms of diversity and inputs of diversity, I think this is a really critical part. So the Australian government designed the hubs to have diverse inputs. Our membership spans farming systems groups, service providers, landscape boards, First Nations groups, and many others. That melting pot of ideas coming together to co-design and create good projects, that's really powerful. The other part that I think we heard from this morning is it's not just about people in agriculture thinking about agriculture. It's the diversity of inputs from people that are working in the medical sciences, health sciences, defence space, bringing new ideas as well. And bringing them in, and not just their ideas, but them being embedded in agricultural innovation and creating the next change. So diversity is critical to the hub. It's part of our mandate, and it's something that we're looking to make sure we've got really diverse inputs to deliver on.
Thanks, Stephen. Joe, they're comfortable chairs, but I'm going to get you to answer this next one. What strategies do industry bodies like yours have in place to improve the social licence to farm and to attract employment to the sector?
Oh, that's a good one.
I think you're on. Flick it up.
Social licence. It's been talked about a lot, and I think we do really well at doing the animal welfare. I talked about animal welfare, our environmental stewardship. We all do it quite well, and I think as farmers we do it. Are we actually talking about it enough is probably the issue. I think farmers, I think we have got social licence to do the operations that we need to do, but I think we could do it better. We could actually ensure that our markets understand what we're doing on farm is actually looking after our land, looking after our animals, and to produce premium food and fibre. And I think that's the message that we've got to continue to do, is to advocate to our customers how great our products are. And I suppose the social licence in there, we do have to have systems behind that to actually enforce, to ensure that we can actually demonstrate to our markets. We're going to talk about the sheep sustainability framework and the cattle sustainability framework. Great frameworks, very high level, but they actually indicate that we are actually doing some really good stuff on South Australian and Australian farms. So I think that's where we've got to head.
Great. Paul, there's kids in school that have only now seen interest rates rising during their lifetimes. It's been a long time since they've risen. At Flow, every first Tuesday of the month, we've got circled in the calendar. It's coming up shortly. How sensitive to rising interest rates are the Australian agriculture sector?
I think everybody's sensitive to interest rates, and if we look at what's taken place as a result of having them down for such a long period, any movement upwards is seen as being difficult for everyone, whether you're a household, whether you're a business in town, or whether you're a farm business operation as well. So sensitivity is quite high. I do think that we are going to have to get used to a higher regime, and I think to some degree we've been perhaps falsely held up with low rates as a result of COVID and other things. To give you an idea, if you look at what's the long-term inflation rate that the RBA has been advocating, it's around between 2 and 3%. Now, we've been less than that from an inflation perspective, but by virtue of that being the long-term average of where they want things, you can see that therefore the cash rate needs to be above 2%. That's the long-term equilibrium of where it needs to be. So when we've been travelling at 0.1%, as has been the case for quite an extended period of time, We needed to see that as being something where we were being discounted rather than that being normal. And I think we're just heading simply back to normal. No different to what we see with, for example, exchange rates with the Australian dollar. Those things fluctuate as well, but there is a natural level of where the average is, and we need to think of that. So that's a little bit of economics. In terms of to the question of how hard is it going to be, I think it is going to be a challenge. The reason it's going to be a challenge is that it's happening in conjunction with other cost increases. And I think it's therefore a raft of increases that's taking place. It's another input cost on top of fuel, energy, fertiliser, labour, and everything else that you go to mention. So I think that there is a little bit of pain in front of us to manage this, but let's put our faith in the RBA and the policies that are in place, that we're looking to do this as an interim period to get things back into equilibrium. But equilibrium for interest rates, I think, is going to be certainly not where it has been.
Yeah, just on that one, when Tony had his pictures up there of the headwinds we're facing, I might go to you with this one, Adrian. This is off the list, but it is an input cost, as you've just said, finance itself. What is for grain producers, for instance, the heavy challenges with input costs going forward, including finance?
I think it's the uncertainty of it. So how long's this war going to last? And then what does the Ukraine look like afterwards? How are we going to get product out of there? Certainly talking about fertiliser at the moment. China, the messages coming out of China are really scary at the moment, aren't they? So at the moment we're probably talking input costs, chemicals, I reckon my experience would be 30-35% up this year. Obviously fertiliser's a good 100% over the top depending on where you purchased. Supply is probably even more critical than that. At the moment, our grain prices can certainly sustain where everything is at the moment, including interest rates. So there's some bit of resilience there. There's some opportunity, noting that Andrew Whitelaw's speaking a bit later, but there's some opportunity, obviously, to take some long-term pricing risk out of it, so some business risk. I think that's it may be the uncomfortable one at the moment. When do you sign up for long-term resilience? But if you look at the prices going forward, is it short-term? Well, no. It could be another couple of seasons, I think, before we see daylight. So we actually do need to take some proactive moves against these high prices, whether they be fuel, everything else in the world, and the world uncertainty. So, we've seen land prices go to amazing levels, interest rates coming off the bottom. They're still not high. So hopefully there's some resilience built in there, and banks making that resilience happen a little bit as well. But I think as a business side of it, we really do need to look at that long-term pricing to see where our capacity to handle is.
All right, Paul, were you wanting to jump back in on that topic? No, that's fine.
No. I just think uncertainty, I think, is the key word that you've mentioned. I think if people could have a crystal ball and look into it and see what it means, it makes planning so much easier. But unfortunately, that is not the case. And if we look at things like, say, the Ukraine war, what we thought even of it in January and February and what we think of it now are totally different in terms of our sense of duration that may go on for and what impact that's having. Yep. So I think uncertainty is the big thing.
Stephen, I'll ask you this question. It's been on the list for a while here. Do you think PIRSA, our state ag department here, needs to set a strategy on climate change and adaptation, or are the good work of blueprints and industry strategies enough to guide South Australia?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The PIRSA is a key part of the Drought Hub, so that the Drought Hub's being led by the University of Adelaide in partnership with PIRSA, and I think in part that the reason for such a strong buy-in from PIRSA has been its commitment around drought resilience and the natural extension of that to climate resilience as well. I'm certainly quite familiar with the industry blueprints. Climate change and addressing climate change and mitigating the risks around that are front and centre of our state's blueprints, as well as at the national level. I'm not familiar with PIRSA's climate change policy, so I don't want to comment there, but there's a lot of active work that PIRSA is doing through the Hub and other initiatives, other programs that I'm very aware of, that are working to make sure that farmers are both part of the solution, as Joe talked to, around reducing emissions, and also able to set up their systems that they're able to deal with a greater range of environmental fluctuation, whether it's heat stress in livestock and mitigating against that, or really being able to grow amazing crops off pretty low within season rainfall as well. So those kinds of things are the types of projects that we're looking to roll out in partnership with PIRSA as well as many other members of the hub.
All right, we've got two chairs in chairs here, so I'll ask a question about leadership that's come through. Successful organisations or sporting clubs usually have sound leadership. What's being undertaken to deliberately and specifically address leadership in agriculture? Joe, I think you can go first on this one.
Yeah, I do too.
Thanks, Adrian. I guess at Livestock SA, we've developed an organisation over 10 years. I'm going to be a bit evasive here. I think we don't do leadership development as well as we could. Certainly, I know within our board structure we've fostered younger people to come onto our board, and I hope that they've gained some leadership skills from that. But we actually don't have any state-based farming organisation leadership courses to foster that leadership. But I know the NFF do it really well. Wool producers do some courses, sheep producers do some courses, so there are lots of opportunities nationally, but I do know Livestock SA, that's an area that we could focus on if we have more resources. It's a resourcing issue as much as anything else to foster and grow people, but I do hope that people that have been, the younger fraternity that have been on our board have actually gained some leadership skills out of that. Thanks.
I'm going to throw a question at you, Adrian, but do you want to add anything to what Joe's just said? Amen?
Yeah, pretty much. I think some of this stuff with not massive resources, it's crucial that certainly as Grains we couple with the national organisations and not try and recreate the wheel. That's part of our memberships to national organisations. There's some terrific courses, so I think we just need to adapt them slightly to make sure we've got good continuance through our state-based organisations.
I'll keep you while you got your mic on there. A couple of questions at the top of the chart here just about younger people in the industry. Have we had an opportunity to bring a lot more young people into the industry? How can we do it? How do we promote the ag industry to be attractive to younger people? It's been a bit of a theme in the early presentations today.
I think this is one of those. I think we're in one of those times where we've got a massive disruptor to the older generation, and I think it's sustainability. I think it's the nearly the direct drilling of the early 90s or the tax system change during the late 90s, where it's a real opportunity for the next generation to go, no, I want to own this, I want to transform our business, I want to be sustainable, I want to be here for the long term, and I want to access markets, and I want to maybe get some niche markets. I think that's a real opportunity for the youth to get involved and to transition in their businesses. Obviously, there's a larger piece around education we've talked about, a lot trying to happen in the background, and certainly as an organisation, we're certainly looking at that proactively. There's some great work being done by Belinda Kay and her team and others around the place, but that certainly needs to be accelerated. There's an ag teacher resource being put on. It's not enough, and we need to resource it. The other side of that is, we've had 15 years of decreasing investment into PIRSA. Like, it's just not Labor governments. It's been every government. It's 60 million wiped off PIRSA in the last 15 years. So that's got to stop. We've got to articulate that better. So that's the attitude to government towards agriculture. So maybe, advocacy organisations, we've just got to get down and harder and lobby and be more involved in advocacy as a whole group of industry, I think, to really sell our cause.
All right, I'm going to ask one last question because we're getting close to lunch, and I'll go start with Paul, and I'll get you each to answer this coming back across. You mentioned a younger generation, a disruptor on sustainability. People's willingness to talk about mental health has now escalated. People are much more willing to talk about their challenges and their struggles, and are we underestimating? There was a question there that came through to Tony earlier about promoting well-being or addressing the well-being gap. How do we underestimate the impact of mental health and well-being on the resilience and success of agriculture in South Australia or indeed the nation, Paul?
I think the answer has to be yes, unfortunately. I think we have underestimated the importance and the need to manage it. If we go back to when the drought was at its peak a couple of years ago, and that was the birth of the investment corporation in many ways. But there's a financial issue, there's an economic issue, but probably in many respects those things are in part dwarfed by the mental health and wellbeing elements that go with it. And myself as a second generation, but I'm only a part-time farmer, that element of managing the day-to-day when you own that in the head of a drought, when you just don't quite know when it's going to end and what do you do, it's an extreme situation, and you have to be in it to understand it. But I think certainly it's something which we do have to manage. In some respects, something such as the Investment Corporation and the drought loans which we issued is a way to try and screen some of those mental health issues. It doesn't take away that day-to-day uncertainty and what shall I do, but at least it deals with one issue, which is around at least I can, if I get this loan, I can at least support things for the time being. But I think overall, I would say, and it's not just agriculture, but I think it's across society. We see it in, for example, elite sporting like we haven't seen before. But mental health is something which we need to take very seriously about how we manage it, and we all need to take a holistic approach to us contributing to everybody's well-being, including our own. We will go to a doctor and look at and get a check-up on our heart, but we don't do enough of just simply looking after our own well-being to make sure we're in that sort of space that we can cope. So I'm I guess a strong advocate to know that I think we need to do more, and I think it is about, if you look at that diversity aspect, I would say that the presence of women in agriculture is one way to assist that greater than it being dominated by males. They do have a different sense of being able to support people, I think, through those difficult times, and I think we need to therefore embrace further the diversity that goes with that to assist with that challenge.
Yep, Stephen, resilience is in your title, so I'm sure it's in the wheelhouse.
Absolutely, yeah. So mental health and wellbeing are absolutely critical. There's no way the hub can be expecting farmers and communities to make successful adaptations and achieve practice change on farm if people aren't in an appropriate position from a mental health and wellbeing perspective to be even thinking about that. I guess just at the moment we're in a, generally speaking, as Tony Mahar alluded to, some better times. So hopefully we're in a position to be thinking about making those changes. At a future drought fund level, the hubs are only one aspect of the future drought fund, which is the primary resource for the hubs. There's really significant pillars of investment into mental health and wellbeing and community connection within the future drought fund. That recognises the importance that those things play in being able to affect change through industry. If we don't get the mental health right, then the rest of it's a little bit academic.
The chairs of our member bodies on this subject of mental health are an important string to the bow for your members.
Yeah, so we're very aware of it. Obviously, we deal with bushfires. We dealt with trying to get through the RIC program during droughts. There's a lot of things that have caused mental health. So yeah, we're at the forefront of it. Our board's very aware of it. We tried to set up a task force to handle it and look into it. It wasn't successful. So we'll change that as a new board going forward. We'll have to have another way to get this going. I think a lot of the time in mental health we look to people who may have some mental health issues to take lead on this. I don't think that's not fair either. The resourcing in rural mental health is hopeless. I think it's 5 years to get a decent appointment once you get diagnosed with a mental health issue. So it's really problematic to actually get any runs on the board in this area. RBS do a terrific job. Brett Smith handles this area particularly on behalf of our industry, but it is really a difficult area because the resources you can't resource labour is just such a massive issue, and the qualifications just don't exist to go out to rural areas to help us solve it. But certainly as an organisation, we've looked at it. We tried to look at it deeper. It didn't get the traction we want, so we'll have to. With the new board going in, as far as yesterday, we'll have to pivot and do it and access that another way to be more effective. And so all criticisms are fair, but we will certainly continue to try and advocate in this area.
Joe, Livestock SA.
Oh yeah, it's a huge issue. Actually, I think cross-commodity issue, we need to talk together because it is a huge issue and we know it's under-resourced in the regions, and we've got a Labor government that's focusing on health. Let's hope we can build that resource base so we can actually get the support for people who are actually in mental health trauma. We know we've got the FAB mentors. They've been a really great asset during the drought seasons that we've had in the last few years, and also when we have bushfire. I'd have to say, you only have to scratch the surface. We had and it was poor media reporting about FMD in Australia, even though it was fragments and all of that. But all of the reporting that came out there needs to be accurate, because a lot of it was misleading, and it raised the anxiety levels of our producers quite alarmingly. We were getting responses into our board, into the office, just they couldn't believe that what was going on. We say, no, FMD is not in Australia. You don't need to concern yourselves. But they were concerned. A stock agent told me that people are talking about, do I sell my livestock now? How do I get vaccinated? Animals getting vaccinated. All of those sorts of issues. It only just takes bad media reporting, so we actually need to understand how we actually get accurate reporting so that our producers are actually informed and don't raise those anxiety levels. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, good point, Joe. You could carry on with that conversation at the back of the room. They're waiting for you up there. I'll let you get an early leave pass while we just finish wrapping up the program for this section. Thank you for your questions that came through. Maybe if your question didn't get asked, maybe line up people over lunch and ask the question yourself. Thank you, Joe. We will break for lunch. In fact, thank you all of you. Please thank all the panel members.